Hello, and welcome to our Reserve Study FAQs webinar. This webinar is sponsored by Association Reserves. My name is Paige Sharman, and I'm the Director of Marketing for Association Reserves, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today. Reserve Study FAQs is a webinar we've created to answer the most common questions we receive from board members and community managers. If you've ever wondered what a reserve study really includes, how often it should be updated, what percent funded means, or how to interpret the funding plan, you're not alone. Today's session is designed to provide clear, practical answers and helpful context so you can make informed decisions for your community with greater confidence. Due to the number of people attending, everyone has been muted, but you can ask questions at any time by typing your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your control panel. We'll be answering your questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the broadcast, so type your questions and we'll get to as many as time allows. Now it's time to introduce our speaker. Our host today is Bryan Farley, President of Association Reserves Colorado. Bryan has completed over 3,000 reserve studies and earned the Community Associations Institute designation of Reserve Specialist. Since 2011, Bryan has served all types of properties and associations, ranging from international high-rises to historical monuments. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Bryan. Bryan?
Thank you so much, Paige. Yes, I appreciate that you took the time out today to join me. So we're going to go through this. This is about a 40 to 45-minute presentation. And I will do my best really to set the stage for, really in mind, I had new board members, owners, and new managers as well. So I want to explain really the ground level basics of a reserve study. But what I have found is that even when I explain some of the basics, veteran, well-experienced managers benefit from this. And the reason being is they're not doing this every single day. This is something I do every single day. So I'm able to help potentially communicate some of the confusion or things that are misinterpreted with reserve studies. So let's start in getting into it. I'm going to turn off my camera so that I can have you all focus just on the presentation. So let's start off with the first question that you may receive. What is a reserve study? And this question may be posed during a board meeting when the suggestion is, hey, we need to get a reserve study done this year. And someone may raise their hand and say, well, what's a reserve study again? I don't think we need that. I can know my way around a spreadsheet. I think I can do this myself. Or didn't we already do one 4 years ago? Why do we need another one? The components haven't changed, right? So what's the point of getting this reserve study completed? And why is this going to be helpful for us? So with this question, I've actually found it best to use an analogy. And the analogy that I've had success with is, well, a reserve study is a map. It is a guideline. Why is a map helpful? So when we go on a road trip, let's just say I'm going to take a road trip to New York City at some point. When I pull out my map, before I even get going, I need to establish, number one, where is my starting point? And then secondly, where's my destination, right? I mean, that's like something that we do now all the time. We get in our car, we take out our GPS, like Google Maps or whatever it may be, and we just plug in, where's our destination? Get me there. And then the next question that's posed is, well, where's your starting point? Okay, so the reserve study answers those two questions for you, for your association's finances. Where are we today financially? And then where are we headed? So if I'm going to New York City, I need to hop on the 70. I need to start going down. But what's going to happen if potentially is I may run into some traffic or I might hit a detour. Now, do I throw my map out the window and say, this is no good, it didn't help me? No, rather I take a look at my map one more time and say, okay, well, where's my starting point now? Where am I? Am I in Nebraska, for example? Okay, here's my starting point, and I've hit a detour, so I need to go around that detour and then keep heading towards my destination. So the reserve study acts in that way. When we are updating our reserve study regularly, we're going to be able to anticipate cost changes or inflationary pressures that are occurring every single year for your property. Your roofing expenses are potentially much higher than they were 4 years ago. Do you throw your reserve study out because 4 years ago the prices were one thing and today their prices are different? No, right? You pull out your reserve study, you get a fresh reserve study, you recalibrate your reserve study, and you head off with the same destination of being properly funding your association's components at your property. Now, when you explain this concept to your owners, they're going to say to you, okay, well, isn't this going to help us for the future? Because we don't need to replace our roof anytime soon. So is a reserve study just something that we plan for the future? And the problem with framing that conversation that way is once we talk about the reserve study being for the future, now what gets into the owners or the board members' heads is, well, the future is something someone else can worry about. I'm just trying to take care of my bills today. I need money to pay for my car, right? Like I have real bills going on today, and I'd rather use the money I would pay the HOA to actually take care of those sorts of things. But rather, let's talk about the reserves paying for the here and now, the ongoing deterioration occurring at your property. Because if we can frame the conversation as you live in a homeowners association or a community association, you have an obligation to pay for your bill for the usage of the assets while you live here. Meaning, if you live in a community association for 1 year, you should be obligated to pay for your 1 year's usage of all of the components at the property, whether you have a community with a pool and tennis courts, or you just have a community with a fence that goes around the perimeter of the property. You're utilizing or benefiting from that asset while you live there. Now, what's unfair is if we say, well, that's someone in the future's problem to worry about. I'm not going to pay for my fair share or my usage of those assets. Therefore, I'm going to not pay my fair share and let someone else deal with that. Well, that is unfair. That is not fulfilling the fiduciary responsibility of the board to take care of the usage and take care of the ongoing deterioration of those assets while the community is constantly deteriorating. Every owner has an obligation to pay for their fair share of the usage of those assets while they're deteriorating. Now, another question then may be posed, okay, well, I pay all this money into the association. I pay my dues on time. I pay my assessments on time. Where is this money actually going? And why do the costs seem like they keep on going up every single year? Or if they're not going up, why aren't they going up, right? So where is this money going that you're putting aside every year into your association? So your dues are going to be separated out into two buckets. You have your operating expenses and your reserve expenses. So your operating expenses, these are recurring expenses that happen every month to month or year to year. And they're generally on a per transactional basis, less than 1% of your total annual budget. And then if you have to replace something, it's going to be completed as needed. So for example, let's just say you have some garage lights and the delivery truck hit a few of them, right? That's something that I've seen commonly recently. Do you have to go to the reserves because only 3 lights need to be replaced? Or can you just say, okay, well, we can handle that from our operating budget, right? We'll complete those as needed. It's a one-time kind of expense. It's an as needed expense. Okay, so that's the operating side. The reserve portion, right? Again, you pay your dues. Part of it goes into the operating and then part of it goes into reserves. And so the reserves then for your association, these are also for recurring expenses, but these expenses occur on a much longer timeline. Every 3 to 5 years, every 5 to 10 years, every 50 years, every 60 years. On a per transaction basis, they're greater than 1% of the total annual budget. And then when you have an expense, it's going to be planned for. These are not things that are surprises. These are done, things that we can expect and predict. So then what does Colorado law then state for an association? Are you required to have a reserve study? Well, per Colorado law, what is legislated is that you must have a policy in place that addresses the following. Does your association have a reserve study prepared for the portions of the community? Is there funding for the work recommended in the reserve study? Is there a funding plan? And then where's the projected sources of funding for the work? And then whether your reserve study is based on a physical or financial analysis. So that is the only requirement for Colorado law, is that you must have a policy in place for your association. If you don't have a policy in place, we have templates on our website at reservestudy.com under the resources tab. So that's where you can find a template policy or a sample policy. But please keep in mind that even though there's no requirement in Colorado currently requiring a reserve study, other industries are now taking note of the funding status for communities. For example, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac came out with new guidelines a few years ago addressing reserve studies. So Fannie and Freddie are the largest underwriters in America that help underwrite a lot of the loans that are given out for mortgages. And their guidelines now recommend the following: that a reserve study for a community, like a condo association, must have a reserve study dated within the last 36 months or 3 years. The reserve study then must be prepared by an independent expert skilled in performing reserve studies. And then the reserve study must comment favorably on the project's age or the community's condition. So again, just because a state is not legislating a reserve study be done, other industries, I've heard even issues from insurance companies, there are other entities now interested on the funding status of your association's reserves. So it's important to keep top of mind. Again, these are the largest underwriters for mortgages. This helps your homeowners sell their units in a timely fashion. So then the question then may come next, well, okay, are we in good shape? Is my association properly funded? And this is exactly a great question to ask at this point. How do we know if we're properly funded? And that's exactly what a reserve study is going to be telling you. Are we in good shape? And if not, where do we go from here? So a reserve study provides your owners and your board members with 3 key results. Those results are the component listing, the reserve fund strength, and the funding plan, as you can see here on screen. And these answer the common questions. Okay, what are we even responsible for taking care of? What are the components at our property? Then next, do we have enough money in our bank account to actually fund these components? And then lastly, if we don't have enough money currently, well, how much money do we need? And so that's where we're going to go through these 3 results in the next few slides. So first of all, how do we even define what components at your property are to be included within the reserve study, right? What's the filter we utilize to address the components at your property? Well, based on National Reserve Study standards, which were updated in 2023, there is a 3-part test which dictates which assets are to be included within your reserve study. And they're relatively simple to follow. So number 1, is the component at your property an association's obligation to maintain? So for example, if you live in a development where the city takes care of the roads, is that an association's asset? No, right? The association does not have to take care of that because it's someone else's responsibility. Or in your declarations, who's responsible for replacing windows? Is it the owner? Well, that's not association's responsibility. That's the first test. Second, can we anticipate when this expense will occur? If we cannot predict when it will occur, then we cannot include it within the reserve study because we need to be able to create a schedule of replacement for the component. So if there is no predictable schedule, it cannot be included. And then lastly, does this component have a predictable scope and cost of work? So some examples for the last 2. If you have some sort of foundational structural issue at your community, when will your foundation fail? It's a rhetorical question, but hopefully never, right? You don't want your foundation to fail. And then what's the cost going to be if your foundation were to fail? Well, we don't know, right? So for those last 2, those are generally described as like structural items, lines. So electrical lines or plumbing lines fall into those categories, or other like electrical sorts of issues. So really they fall into those 3 categories. So structural, lines, or plumbing, those sorts of things. So once we utilize this filter, we can then address all the components at your property. And so when we look at a community, here's a hypothetical component listing that we'll now see. So we went to the property, we utilized the National Reserve Study standards as our filter, and we've now created your reserve study component listing. Now, based on our review of the components while we are on site, we're able to establish the following. What is the description of the component that we see? When was this component installed? And then how long should this component last based on best practices or based on vendor recommendations or based on just what we're seeing in your local area. And then currently, what's the cost to replace this component? So you can see here, we've got the description, the useful life, the remaining life, and the cost. So let's look at the roof component, for example, right here. The roof is a 20-year component, meaning it should last about 20 years. It could last 18, it could last 22. Most likely, it's not going to last 40 years or 30 years. It will generally start to fail before that. This component has a remaining useful life of 18. This tells us that this roof was replaced 2 years ago, right? Because it's only used up 2 years of its life. And its current estimated cost, not what it was replaced for, but its current cost based on today's averages is about $80,000, right? Again, we're talking about the current average cost or the here and now cost of these components. So if you take a look at all these components, you're going to see something. You're going to notice that most components out of any community we face is going to start having significant costs within the 20 to 30-year time frame. And this hypothetical example is no different. We had an $80,000 cost 2 years ago. We have another $80,000 cost in 5 years. We have a $50,000 cost next year and another $50,000 cost in the next few years. So be aware that the majority of your components are not going to be equally shared over the life of the property. Rather, it's going to look something like this, where you have a large expense occurring that's kind of an outlier. And so that's the problem with reserve expenses. They are by nature unfair and unequal. So if you're not utilizing a reserve study, it's kind of a roll of the dice. Did you happen to live within the community at the wrong time? And if so, you might be special assessed. You might need to borrow money to take care of those assets. But we believe this is the wrong way of doing it. Rather, a reserve study acting as a map and a guideline will now flatten out these expenses so that every owner, whether they lived here 30 years ago or live here 30 years from now, everyone's going to be paying for their fair share of the usage of these assets while they live at the property. They are only obligated to pay for their fair share of the usage of those assets while they live there. So based on the components at your property, how do we now know whether or not we have enough money to take care of those components? So this is the next question that we need to address. Based on the components at our property, do we have enough money? And how do we establish that? Well, that is why the reserve study now answers that question utilizing the reserve fund strength. So the reserve fund strength is a way for us to address whether or not a community is financially healthy or unhealthy. And the way that we address that is utilizing a calculation that we call the percent funded. Percent funded. And so the calculation for the percent funded is on screen here. We take what is currently in the reserve account, and then we divide that by the dollar value in accumulated deterioration, also called the fully funded balance. Now I'm going to show you that on the next screen. Even though it's a lot of syllables, it's actually a really simple calculation. Now I'll show you that on the next slide. But when we utilize this calculation, we get the percent funded. And the percent funded now tells us our statistical health. Okay? Please keep that in mind. It's not the end all be all. Rather, it shows us the statistical health. So why is that helpful? Well, when I go to the doctor and I get my blood pressure checked, I try to shoot for 120/80. That's like my goal. I generally have higher blood pressure. Now, when I'm at 120/80, does the doctor tell me, hey, you're a great person. Good job. You've done it. You did it. No, they just say, hey, you're at a low risk right now. You're no issues. But if I'm higher, like 130/90 or whatever, are they going to tell me, hey, you're a bad person. You need to really fix your life up and get some things together? No, they're just going to say, hey, you're right now currently trending towards higher risk. So percent funded is that same sort of health metric. It tells us our relative risk statistically. Okay. So the reason why I want to make sure that's clear is that some people look at percent funded and now say, okay, we're a bad community or we're a good community. It does not tell you any moral judgment. It just tells you, statistically speaking, what is my risk level today? And again, that's going to change tomorrow. So going through the percent funded calculation, let's talk about that denominator. So the percent funded, again, works like this. If we have a component at our property, let's just say right now you're looking at the computer screen and you say, my monitor should last about 10 years. My computer should last about 10 years. And my computer is really fancy, so it's going to cost me $10,000. So if you were to be keeping pace with the rate of deterioration or the cost of deterioration for your computer, you would be setting aside $1,000 every year to be keeping pace with the rate of deterioration. So in year one, even though you just replaced your computer last year, you should be allocating about $1,000 towards your computer screen or to your computer. Year five, you should have about $5,000 saved up. In year 10, you replace your computer for $10,000, but you don't need $10,000 anymore, right? Because you just replaced it. Now you only need $1,000 again because we started over the life. Now in year 10, if you only had $7,000, what's your percent funded, right? You're 70% funded. You have 70% of the total funds on hand to replace your computer monitor. So it's a pretty simple way of looking at your association's financial health. It's just saying, based upon the accumulated value deterioration, so how old and how expensive are your components, do you have adequate funds to replace those components? And then once you replace those components, all of the costs actually reduce. So if you have $1 million expense, it's no longer going to be $1 million worth of accumulated value deterioration once you replace it. Rather, it drops down based upon the ratio of its life and its expenses. So then after explaining that, someone may raise their hand and say, well, okay, that sounds good. I guess I didn't fully get it, maybe, but why do I care, right? And I like to explain the math behind it because I like to show how simple it really is. But really, this is why we care. Because it's going to tell us the risk of special assessment for your community. Because what we found after doing over 100,000 reserve studies is we found that when a community is over 70% funded, their risk of special assessments and deferred maintenance and other cash flow issues decreases to less than 1%. There's a less than 1% chance risk of special assessments and deferred maintenance. Whereas when a community is 30% funded and below, that risk increases drastically. So you can see there that even if you're 0% funded, there's a risk of approximately having about a 60% chance risk of special assessment. So be aware of that. It's like that blood pressure monitor. If I can just potentially change my diet or exercise a bit more, I can greatly reduce my risk level. Same thing is going to occur with your association. Being properly funded greatly reduces your risk of special assessments and cash flow deficiencies that your community may experience. And this will benefit all owners at your property, lowering the cost as well, because a special assessment is not cheap. But someone may say at your community, well, I don't care. Like, I'm good with those odds. If it's only potentially a 60% risk, if I'm 0% funded, why should I care? Well, the reason they should care is that underfunding your reserves is actually going to cost your owners more money. And so let's go through why it's going to cost your owners more money. Well, it costs your owners more money because they're paying more for the same project. So let's just say you have a wood painting or even just a small wood repair component at your property. If you defer this project because you don't want to take care of it, because you don't have adequate funding and reserves, that project is going to increase not only in cost due to scope of work increasing, but also due to inflation. So deferred maintenance will cost everybody at your property more money due to the scope of work increasing, as well as due to the fact that inflation is now acting upon each component. So in this example, you could see here, this was a potentially small repair component that then was deferred or not done, or procrastinated is another word you could utilize. The can was kicked down the road, and now it's expanded into a large replacement project. So the cost of just a small paint job could have been about $2 to $3 a square foot, has now turned to potentially over a $25 per square foot project. So the scope of work is now costing the owners more money. This also has an impact on just the livability of your community. If you're constantly living in a community that is deferring projects, it becomes disorganized and sloppy, really, right? It's something that's not sightly. It doesn't look so good. It kind of looks like this comic here where it's not the greatest place to live because things are just not taken care of because they're constantly deferred. But also keep in mind that inflation is constantly occurring or constantly compounding at your association for the components at your property. So this is a really helpful index that you can look online at. It is the Mortenson Cost Index. It's a construction cost index that they put together to just track what are the construction costs going around the country. And Denver is one of the cities they track. And you could see that in 2020 to 2021, there was a drastic increase. Now, we all know what happened, right? Things changed really significantly during those 2 years. But what people, I think, are unaware of is these numbers are still going up. 2025 alone, we saw it said over a 7.5 increase in the costs for construction related materials. That includes labor and actual materials. So when you defer a project, again, the scope of work increases, things get aesthetically less pleasing, but additionally, you're now paying drastically more money than you could have the year prior. So just in 2025, if a project was deferred just a year, potentially expect a 7.5% increase. So delaying a project only costs the owners more money. So it's not a wise choice to just defer just because you don't have enough money. Rather, if you have adequate funds in your reserve account, you can complete projects on time in a timely manner, which then saves everybody at your association more money. Another consequence that the association will face if they do not have adequate funds in their reserves is that they're going to have to utilize either a special assessment or a loan to now fund that same project. So this example is showing us if we have a 15-year project that costs us $250,000 and the interest on the bank that you're putting your money into over those 15 years is at 1%. So really nominal interest rate at 1%. So even with that nominal interest rate at 1%, the yield on that, if we're putting in reserves consistently over the 15-year life of this hypothetical equation, you can see that owners end up paying about $20,000 less. But remember, 15 years is quite a long time. Most homeowners in your community will live at a property on average about 7 years. So every owner pays less money towards the same component versus if you have to special assess, you now have one set of unlucky owners that need to vote an assessment in and then replace the project for the expected costs, losing about $20,000. Now, if you have to get a loan, that is going to cost more money as well. Why? Because you now have to pay the bank the privilege of borrowing their money, and you have to pay that money back. Again, impacting only a subset of owners. Potentially that loan payment term could be 6 to 7 years potentially, but it's affecting a smaller subset of owners. So the most affordable, the most equitable, the fairest way of collecting funds to pay for an expense is going to be utilizing budgeted reserve transfers. This is fair, this is equitable, and it's going to be a lot cheaper, saving all of your owners much more money. Now, lastly, what we have found is that underfunded associations actually are going to yield a lower for sale price. What we found is that when comparing associations that we've worked with, comparing their percent funded, and then going and comparing them to online real estate transactions, we're finding that well-funded associations yield about a 12% higher return on equity. So they're able to sell their units for about 12% higher than similar associations and similar type properties are selling for. So 12% is actually a really good return just for living in a community that's well-funded. Now, I always want to be careful. Causation, correlation, those sorts of things. We want to be careful. But from my experience, what I found is that poorly funded associations generally aesthetically are less pleasing as for curb appeal, right? If there's no money to take care of the association, then projects get deferred. Therefore, things just don't look as potentially aesthetically pleasing. Whereas a well-funded association, things run smoothly, projects get done on time. If you need to replace something, they're able to fund those projects. Additionally, for a project or for a community that is poorly funded, there might be rumors of special assessments. There might be distrust of the board, those sorts of things. And those things can potentially spread. So be aware. I want to always be careful on caveating that, but we are seeing the data show that well-funded associations are actually getting a better return on their equity. And again, that is based upon how well-funded they are. So it is impactful. And the reason why I'm sharing this with you is to show it is important, right? If you have an owner that says, why should I care? Well, it can save you money or it can make you more money to be well-funded. That's important. People do care about their finances. So let's show them how beneficial it is. So now we've understood why should we care about what our percent funded is, what our percent funded even is. Where do we go from here? Well, now we need to say, well, how much money do we need in our reserve account to be properly funded? So this is where the reserve study tells us the funding plan. And so what's the funding plan going to tell us? It is going to tell us that we need sufficient cash over the life of the property. We need a stable transfer rate or contribution rate into the reserve account over the 30 years or over the life of the property, that our costs for the reserve transfers need to be evenly distributed over the life of the property for every single owner. And then additionally, our recommendation or our funding plan must be fiscally responsible, meaning we cannot expect to rely on a special assessment or rely on a loan. Rather, we need to self-fund the association, utilizing reserve transfers to properly fund the association's expenses. And so once we make those recommendations, we're able to get the reserve study completed for a community. And the great thing about the reserve study is that it's rather simple to then digest once we have all that information. And in fact, this is just a snapshot of what we call the executive summary of the reserve study. The intention here is that you should be able to take a look at this page in 3 minutes or less to now have a good grasp of the association's finances and our way forward. Again, utilizing it like a map. Where's our starting point? What's our destination? And then where are we currently? Like, where are we? So let's go through that. So here's an example for the funding plan and the reserve study executive summary for a hypothetical client. So they have a starting balance of $600,000 and their fully funded reserve balance is about $3.6 million. Now, that fully funded reserve balance, remember, that's that accumulated value of a deterioration, the accumulated value of deterioration, which we call the fully funded reserve balance. So we take those two numbers, we divide them, and you can see here, we get a percent funded of 16.7. So 611 divided by 3.6, we get 16.7. So 16.7 now puts this hypothetical association in a high risk range. So currently, statistically speaking, they're at a high risk of special assessments. But note here, there is no recommendation for special assessments. So again, it's not the end all be all. But in this situation, what's going on is this. They're recommended fully funding reserve transfers so that this association can have adequate funding over the life of the property so that they are shooting for a trajectory of 100% funding at the end of that 30-year time frame. This is the recommendation. And look what they're currently doing. They're currently putting in about that amount. So what's important here, what's the takeaway here is the driver of your reserves is actually going to be your transfer rate. This association currently could be poorly funded, but that's not forever, right? It's not an end all be all. We want to encourage all of our board members and all of our owners to recognize the power of putting money into the reserves. That is actually going to be the most important part of your association's finances, is you need to be putting money away every month, every year, right? Warren Buffett, I believe, said, it's not about timing the market when it comes to stocks. It's about time in the market. The same methodology applies for your association's finances. It's not about timing when your projects will occur. Rather, it's making sure that we're consistently putting funds into the reserve account to be properly funded. The reserve study will point you in that direction so that you have proper funding in your reserve account so that when these projects are needing to be replaced or needing to be completed, monies will be set aside ready to go, and you can just write the check right then and there, and you don't need to worry about it. So that's really the important thing, is making sure now with the funding plan that you're following it. And if you can't follow it, that might be a legitimate question, right? What do? We can't afford this. We understand that it's important. We understand that this is something that's needed right now for our association, but we can't afford that. It's just not something that we're capable of doing. Now, how would I respond to that? Well, there's a few ways I like to respond to it. And one of them is just kind of showing how expensive it really is relative to other expenses. That's always a helpful way of looking at costs, is what is it relative to? Well, Starbucks, you can go to Starbucks right now. At least I did the other day, and I got a small drip coffee, and it was about $3.50. Right? So that's kind of expensive, I would say, or maybe not expensive, depending on what year you're used to buying coffee in. Depending when you started drinking coffee, maybe it was $1 when you started. For me, maybe it was like $2. So it's definitely going up for a cup of coffee. However, putting it in context, a well-funded association generally puts in about $3 to $5 per day per unit, right? $3 to $5 per day per unit. Now, this is just a rule of thumb. This is not, you can take this and run with it. We would probably need to do a reserve study to see, is your association, like, does it have less assets, more assets? But on average, this is what we're seeing, about $3 to $5 per day per unit. So relatively, that's about a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So we would say, if your board members or if your owners can afford a cup of coffee, how much more important is it now than to take care of their community? Potentially even the structural integrity or the safety, like roofing systems and siding or windows or your elevator, right? Those are life safety systems. How much more important is that for your community's health? I'm not saying give up a cup of coffee. No way, right? I would never do that. I could never, imagine if I told my wife that, right? That would be insane. She would probably be gone. But we are trying to sell people, do not give up that cup of coffee, but rather put it in perspective. It is important to remember we need to be taking care of our community. It is worth it. It is worth it. It is not something that we just want to defer or just put our head in the sands for. Rather, this is something important that we need to be aware of. But also remember, with a reserve study, it is a recommendation. It is not an obligation. If the board feels like they cannot do this, it's just an impossible uphill battle, take heart, right? Like, be okay that it's not something that they have to do. You've hired us to help consult on what's the right path forward. And that's what we want to tell you. It is a recommendation and not an obligation. And if you hire Association Reserves, you can then take all the information that we provided to you, and you can now run your own analysis within UPlanIt. So if you say, okay, we can't exactly do that transfer rate into our reserves each and every year, what are some other options? Well, UPlanIt gives you the power to then say, okay, what if we only contribute this much? Or what if we maybe don't paint our clubhouse interiors this next year, but paint them in 3 years? What result does that have? What are the effects, or what's the impact? UPlanIt helps you have those what if scenarios in your back pocket, so you can run it live during a board meeting to see, okay, maybe we can potentially delay some non-important projects, like I said, maybe a clubhouse carpet or a clubhouse couch, things that have no life safety issue impacts on your community, but that are more maybe just nice to haves or aesthetics. You can run that and UPlanIt and see what the result may be. Now, another question that we do tend to get is, well, how are you handling inflation? I showed you that cost index. It's going up and to the right. How does the reserve study factor this in? Well, the only way that we can handle inflation or predict inflation is by updating your reserve study. So you'll see that on the reserve study, we're utilizing 3% inflation on the actual reserve study. And so the first question we may get is, well, why are you using 3% inflation? You just showed me that in Denver, it's over 7.5 on an annualized basis from the last year. Why 3%? Well, the 3% is actually showing you the purchasing power of your dollar in your reserve account. So think of it this way. Each year, your reserve account's purchasing power is diminishing by 3% every single year, which stresses, again, the importance of transferring adequate reserves into your reserve account to offset that rate of inflation occurring. Additionally, what we find is that the more frequently you're updating your reserve study, the lower your risk of special assessments are. So if you wait just 3 years to update your reserve study, your increase of special assessment risk relative to an association who updates it every year increases by about 28%. If you've waited 5 years, you've now increased your relative risk by about 35%. Think of it this way. If you've only looked at your association's budget every 3 years or every 5 years, wouldn't you be off? And that's the same way the reserve study is working. If you've received a roofing bid back in 2020, and then go to that roofer today and say, I would like to use this bid. Can we go ahead on this bid? What's the roofer going to tell you? He'll say, no way, right? We need to redo the bid. We have to create a new bid for you. Same thing with the reserve study. The reserve study from 2020 was utilizing those costs from 2020 based on those bids that we saw. Therefore, the reserve study must be updated. Costs are continually increasing every single year. So we need to make sure that we are updating the data within the reserve study to keep pace with the rate or the cost of deterioration occurring, as well as the current costs of all of those components at your property. So now we've hopefully made some ground. We've explained what the reserve study is, how it's helpful, and then why it needs to be updated. So maybe the question will be, well, what is it going to cost us to get a reserve study done? What is it? What's the investment? Is it worth our time to do? And the answer to that is, well, it really does depend. What type of property are you? Are you just a single family home? Are you a townhome? Are you a high rise? There's all these different types of communities out there. And so the way that the cost is determined is just based on complexity. How complex is your property? The more complex it is, the more time that's going to take to do the site visit itself, or to review all the data, or to research all the manufacturers, talk to the vendors, look at all of the documentation. That's going to take more time. Therefore, the costs will be driven by that. But if it's a relatively simple property, if there's less potential time involved, it's going to be a lower cost. So the cost is going to be determined by the scope of work or the complexity of the property. But if you're just interested in, hey, what would it cost? Simply go to our website. It's reservestudy.com, and you go to the top right corner. You can click request a proposal, and you'll receive a proposal shortly. So it's a very simple, free, and easy way to understand what the cost would be to have this map, to have this guideline, so that you're not running your association while blind, right? Like, it's hard to run a multi-million-dollar community association. It's much harder when you don't even know where you're going. Am I going in the right direction? And so that's why the reserve study is so helpful for your community. So as we're wrapping up, let's talk about this. What are the benefits, and why is it helpful to have a reserve study? And hopefully I've answered a lot of those frequently asked questions that you may be receiving, or you may have if you're newer, or if you've maybe seen these questions before. I hope I've done a good job of answering these questions. The takeaways that we want to have are: have a reserve study completed. If you've never had one completed, this is a great time to do it, right? The best time to plant a tree was 50 years ago, but the next best time is today. So we want to make sure that if you've never had a reserve study done, have one completed. If you've had one done 3 years ago, we would recommend have that updated. We don't have to do a brand new reserve study, but it's important to have it updated so we have fresh data. The reserve expenses that your community will experience, these are inevitable and they're predictable. So there should be no surprises on these types of projects. There will be surprises, right? Like, what if there's a sewer line backup, right? Someone put too many tissues down the toilet or something, and then all of a sudden there's some issues, right? Those are surprises. We shouldn't be surprised by the more inevitable things like roofing, siding, right? Those are the sorts of things we want to make sure that we're tracking properly. If we defer our expenses because we're either uninterested or unmotivated to take care of our property, please note that these expenses will only get more and more expensive when they're ignored and they are deferred. And ultimately, everybody is going to pay the cost one way or the other, right? That's going to be either in lower property values, that's going to be special assessments or loans, or if nothing has ever happens for your property, potentially you will experience some larger costs in the future. So we would always recommend that the most affordable, most equitable way to take care of your property is by ongoing predictable reserve transfers into your reserve account. And the way that you can establish that is by utilizing a reserve study to help guide and direct your association towards a financially successful future. Because ultimately, the choice is going to be up to the board. You can either be a community like this, where it's disorganized, sloppy, things are not taken care of, or it can be something like this, right? Where things are completed on time, your roof is done on time, your painting on your siding looks nice, things are taken care of. So ultimately, the choice is going to be up to the board, and the ownership needs to be aware of their part in this. They have an active duty as well to help take care of their community. And so the more educated everybody is at your community, hopefully you can understand and have buy-in so that a reserve study is completed and you can start going on your journey towards a financially successful future. So that is the end of my presentation. I'm going to now pass it back to Paige, and she's going to take some questions for us, and I'm going to do my best to answer them for you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bryan. Great presentation. All right. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a question, please click Q&A on your control panel and type in that question. All right. Let's jump in here. Regarding percent funding, if in that example in year 7, if you have 7,000, is that 100% funded or 70% funded as you're planning to be fully funded in year 10?
So yeah, if you have $7,000, I can go back. Let's just go back since this is a simpler presentation. I can easily go there for you. I said that, and it's harder to find it. So if in year 7, we have $7,000, we are now 100% funding our expenses at our property, the ongoing expenses at our property. So in year 1, if you have $1,000, you're 100% funding that project. In year 5, if you have $5,000, you're 100% funding, right? You have a 1-for-1 ratio. I mean, even put it simply, for every dollar of deterioration, if you match it for $1, you're 100% funding that particular project. And so in this hypothetical example, not to get confusing, but if we're just funding one component, like I said, your computer monitor, you would need $10,000 to replace your computer monitor, right? If you only showed up to Best Buy with $7,000, they would say, well, that's not enough. But remember, for your reserve projects, you have multiple projects occurring at your property, which is why we utilize a 100% funding goal for your community. We recommend a trajectory of 100% funding. However, we understand that because you have potentially more projects simultaneously occurring at your property, even if you only have $7,000 in year 10, you're still going to be at a low risk position, right? 70% funded and greater, because you're able to pool, or what we call the cash flow methodology, pool your funds together to take care of those expenses as they occur. That's a little bit more advanced, but of course, please email me or call me if you have further questions on that concept. But to answer your question, which I went way more above and beyond what your question was, so I'm sorry for doing that. But if you have $7,000 in year 7, you are 100% funded.
Bryan, what happens if the reserve fund is over 100% funded?
Yeah, you would be considered at potentially a surplus. Now, our recommendation is we want to be at around 100% funded. That actually means that some years you might be above that. So we recommend, we say anything between 70% funded to 120, 130% funded is it's kind of the right place to be. Where am I at? Here we go. So if you can see here, the risk levels are here. And the reason why it's varied. That's why I want to be very clear. Percent funded is not the end all be all. So if I go to the doctor and I get my blood pressure checked and they say you're 121/80, am I going to go, oh no, I need to maybe skip dinner tonight? Or if they say you're 119, am I going to go, okay, let me go eat some more potato chips, right? It's the expectation is not to be perfectly there, rather understanding that the future is unpredictable and unknowable. So it's going to be constantly like this. You're going to have some years where you may not need to replace your roof because the roofer came out and said, things look good. So you don't have to actually complete that expense this year. There'd be some years where you have not only a roofing expense that came prematurely, but you also had potentially clubhouse bathroom backed up or whatever. Like there's things like that occur. So we want to say if we're at 100% funded, we're going to have more margin to be able to handle the ups and downs occurring at the property.
All right. Do we have access to UPlanIt if we have used your services for a study in the past?
It depends, right? So when you are currently a client, we give access to that, and it's the formula is it's your fiscal year plus 3 months. That's detailed on a website. But if you just want to purchase a subscription, maybe you haven't hired us in a while, you can purchase a subscription, and that will give you that same timeline of access for UPlanIt.
All right. You mentioned the assumed 3% inflation rate that's used as the baseline for incrementing annual prices. Mentioned that the local inflation rate is higher, but didn't describe the rationale for sticking with the 3% rate. Can you please address that? And or if a community decides to use a higher rate, can you take that into account at community's request when we contract with you for our study updates?
Yeah, great question. I knew this question might have been posed, so I'm thankful that you addressed it. So 3%, remember, and I know you already know this, but 3% we utilize based on the reserve account's purchasing power. Okay, so that's the first thing I know you know that. Then again, here on the slide that you can see on the screen, you'll see that 7% within the last 12 months. So what's going on here? So there's a couple of things that we need to be aware of. If I change the baseline inflation rate on the reserve study from 3% to 4%, the recommendation for your reserve transfers, in order to just keep pace with that change, that 1 point change, I now have to increase your reserve transfers by 22% on average. So we want to be very, very careful on those sorts of changes. If your association requests changing it from 3% to 4%, we now have to adjust your reserve transfer up by about 22%, because inflation is acting on 30 years worth of those expenses, or maybe more, depending on the life cycle of your components. So it's acting on all those compounding over the years. It's now going to require a ton more money currently to then offset that. So since we can't predict what the future inflation will be, that is why we highly recommend updating your reserve study. If costs increase next year by 10%, well, getting an updated, fresh reserve study will now tell you, here's the current cost for these expenses, rather than just utilizing a baseline inflation rate to hopefully project those out. The only way we can get real helpful data is by updating that reserve study to actually get the data that we need for those cost projections. I hope that was clear. And again, please reach out if you need further explanation on that.
All right, Bryan, what if the reserve study doesn't include a component that they know they need in it?
Sure. The best thing you can do is let your reserve specialists know, hey, for example, did you know that the fence bordering our community is actually not the neighboring association's fence? It's our fence. Potentially that wasn't disclosed during the initial site visit. Can we make sure we include that on the next reserve study update? Of course, right? So update the reserve study, get it in there, put it in there, and that can be addressed on the next reserve study update. Or if it's a recent reserve study within the last, let's say, month that it was completed, let your reserve specialists know. They'll go ahead and fix that right away.
Okay, it looks like we've made it through all the questions. So that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, Bryan. If anyone is interested in a recorded version of this or any other webinar, you can search for them on YouTube or on the Association Reserve's webinar page. If you enjoyed today's session and would like to receive the Association Reserve's newsletter or announcements of future webinars, please visit www.reservestudy.com and click the icon to sign up for the newsletter. I want to thank you all for attending. If you have any questions or if there's any way we can be of service to you, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thank you again. Goodbye.